We're back on week 8 on C++ Programming 1. Today I'm going to go over the if-else, and if-else-if statements. The first thing that I want to look at is just the if statement. The if statement consists of an expression within these parentheses which will evaluate to either true or false. Now, you're familiar with what we went over last week, which were the relational operators and the Boolean, which were Boolean operators, and the logical operators which return a true or false. So you're going to be using these so that you can branch out and make a decision based on that condition. In this particular program, we're going to start with the if condition, and we test the condition to say if the average is greater than the high score, then execute whatever is in the body. So the way that you write an if statement, you could do it two ways. You can do it if you have one line that you want to execute for the body of this if statement when it's true. You can just indent the line and then put it underneath the if statement. The other way you can do it is wrap it around with parentheses, and you will get the same result. If you wrap it around with parentheses, now you can put a lot more statements in here. So if I wanted to put something like this, then I can, because if this is true, then this whole body will execute because it's in between this open curly brace and the closed curly brace. So the open curly brace and the closed curly brace indicates that there are compound statements that will be executed as part of this if statement. If you don't have more than one statement and you want to keep your program short, you can always do the following. And this will print out that congratulations, that's a high score, if that statement is true. The other thing you got to watch out for is if I do this, this is not part of the if statement, and you have to be careful. Because you didn't wrap this around in a compound statement with the open and closed curly brace, C++ says, okay, this is just another line of code that I need to execute. So you have to be careful when you're doing if statements. Usually the rule of thumb is if you have one line, you can do that, and then anything after, just indent it back so that you know that this is going to execute no matter what. Or if you have more than one condition, then you'd want to put a compound statement indicating that this is the body of this if statement. So let's take a look at what's going on here. If I execute this program and I put 3 scores, it says your average is 94 and then hello world, right? The problem here is that average was 94 and it asks the question, is 94 greater than high score? High score is 95. That's false, so it won't go into the body of this if statement. Now let me enter higher values. If I do 98, 96, and 100, now it'll hit the if statement. So it's saying if average, which is 98, is greater than high score is 95, then it will enter the compound statements within the body of the if statement. So that's why it reads congratulations, that's a high score. You can use the if statement to drive any type of decisions that you need to make in your program. And within this body, you can put in anything. You can put multiple statements within here. You can put variable declarations within here, which is not recommended, but you could still declare a variable in here. You can do increment operators here. Anything that you can do outside of this if, you can do inside. So anything that you've been doing so far, asking for input, writing output, you can do within this if statement. There is nothing that's preventing you from asking the user for output within the if statement. Now you can have multiple if statements within a program, which will do multiple comparisons. So I can say if average is equal to high score, if average is equal to high score and this condition is true, meaning that you're going to get a 95 and 95, then it'll hit this cout statement. But what's going to happen is this will be executed. If it's true, it'll go into the body, and then this will ask the question again. If it's true, then it'll hit the body. So you can put many if statements within a program so that you do any comparisons that you want. Okay. The next type of statement is called an if-else statement, which will execute a condition execute a group of statements if this statement is true, or otherwise another group of statements will get executed if it's false. And that's the if-else. So what I can do within here is I can do that. The important thing to realize with an if-else statement is that no matter what, one of these bodies will get executed. It'll be either this one or this one, right? When you have an if-else statement, you're going to have one of these bodies execute, because this else indicates a default. If this is true, then execute this statement. If it's false, then it's going to go automatically into the else. Think of the else as your default statement that will get executed if all prior conditions are false. Let's run this. I'm going to enter 3 test scores, 90, 80, and 70. Your average is 80. So what's happening here is it's comparing the 80 versus the high score. It says, is average greater than 95, right? And of course that's not true, so it'll be false, right? Because this is false, then it's going to jump into the else statement and then execute whatever is in the else statement. And that's what happens. So it says better luck next time. Okay. Just like the if statement that I showed you before, you can put many statements within this else. So I can expand this else and write another statement here. And I can expand as many lines of code within this else, just like I can do within this if. I can expand the if body and I can expand the else body depending on what. So it's really like a switch. And it's a decision. And if you look at the book on page 167, it gives you a good example of how it actually works. It's always going to ask the question, if this is true, then do the if statement body. Otherwise, do the else statement body. And it's pretty self-explanatory once you go through the exercises and you start doing the examples. The other thing to remember is that within this if statement, I can use relational operators and conditional operators and logical operators. Doesn't really matter. Now what I can't do is I can't do an if within here. I can't do that. I can't mix. Once you have an if statement outside, anything that goes in here has to evaluate to a true or false. So I cannot put an if statement within here to do that. I can't do that. Okay? But what I can do is I can say and, or I can mix and say average is equal to high score, I can do that because what's happening here is this will evaluate to whatever it evaluates, this will evaluate to whatever it needs to evaluate, Boolean, and then do the OR logical join to it'll evaluate the logical OR within these two operands, and then give you a true false value. And I can do that, and I can put as many ORs and ANDs in here as I want. It doesn't really matter, as long as this whole statement will eventually evaluate to a true or false value. Okay, so you have the advantage of putting in as many conditions as you want within that if statement, and that's how an if-else works. Now, say you wanted to test a series of conditions, then that's when the if-else if comes in. The if-else if statements have a variety of expressions that you can test using the if operator. So what happens is I can expand my conditions. So I can say if average is greater than high score, then print that. Now I can say else if, and I'll go into the default else in a minute, test 1 is less than 60, so let's take a look at this one. This is an if-else if group of statements. What happens is it's always going to go sequentially, but based on the condition result, it will only do one of these compound statements. For example, if it comes here and it says if average is greater than high score, and this condition is true, then it's only going to execute the body of this condition and jump out to the next line of code. So if I do cout end of program, and say, for example, average was 98, or I'm sorry, yes, average was 98, 98 is greater than high score, it's going to print this out, ignore everything else because it already hit one decision, and then print out end of program. So let's take a look at that. So we'll do 96, 98, and 100. Okay, so as you see here, it says your average is a 98, just like we printed out here. And then it goes into the if-else if conditions. It says, if this is true, then print this out. And once it hit that true condition, then it's going to print out the body, it's going to execute the body, and get out of this whole group of statements and go to the next line of code, which is end of program. Okay, and that's how the if-else works. If-else if works is as soon as it finds a true, it'll hit that body and then get out. For example, if I do, and you'll see the condition here, so let me do a 59, 90, and 10, right? The average is 53. This condition is false. What's going to happen is it's going to check the next else if there is any. Is this condition true? Yes, it is true. So it's going to hit this body, execute this body. You did pour on test 1 and get out of these groups of if else if statements. Now, if both of these statements were false, then it'll default to the else. Remember, the else is your default. So if you have a bunch of if else ifs in here and all of them turn out to be false, your safety net would be your else statement. The else statement is not required. The else statement is something that you can put in as a failsafe, but it doesn't require it doesn't require you to put it in. If I cancel this out, I commented this out, that's perfectly fine to do, but now you run the risk of never executing a body within an if else if, because if I did something of the following nature, let me do something like that, and say I did 80, 90, and 70. It's going to say your average is 80. Compare the average. That's false. Next is test 1 less than 60. That's false. And then it's just going to drop through to the cout end of program. Which is, if it's that's the way it's supposed to work, it is. I'm just showing you an example of there could be a possibility that you never execute the body of your if else if. Whereas if I had this failsafe, I know that if these conditions are not true, then this will execute no matter what, because it's my failsafe, it's my default. For example, if I do, again, I'll do 70, 78, 90. This was false, so it's not going to go in here. This was false, so it's not going to go in here. There are no more else ifs, so it's going to go into my else, and it's going to say, better luck next time, you were good though. Right? It runs into my default condition. I can have as many else ifs as I want, so if I did test 2 is less than 70, you're always going to check sequentially. It's always going to go, if it's false, then go to the next one. If it's false, then go to the next one. If this is true, then it'll hit this statement. But remember, because it hit this statement, then it won't hit the else. It's going to come out of the else and go to the next line of code after this group of statements. For example, let's make test 2. So let's do the following. Let's do 65, 65, and 90. So as you see here, your average is 73.3. Not going to hit this, right, because this is going to be false. Not going to hit this either, because 65 is not less than 60, so it's not going to hit this body. Now, we compare test 2 with 70. Is test 2 less than 70? Is 65 less than 70? Yes, it is. So it's going to print out, looks like your test 2 isn't so good either. Notice how, again, it only executed this group of statements, or this statement, didn't go into the else, just jumped out into the next line of code, which is end of program. As you see here, at most, you're always just going to hit one of these group of statements. The only time that you'll hit the else is if anything preceding this is false. Again, the only time that you hit the else is if everything preceding the else is false. The other thing to remember is that you do not have to have a default else. You can have if statements by themselves without a default else, but that just will not have you have a failsafe, and that's perfectly fine depending on what you're trying to do with the program. And that's if else if in a nutshell. And again, within this condition, it's an if else or if else if, you can have any type of logical or relational operators and expressions, so that which should evaluate to either a true or they should evaluate to either a false. On Moodle, there is an exercise for selection statements, and in the book there's questions that you can go over after each section on chapter 4, making decisions. Okay, the next type of decisions we're going to go into is a switch statement, which is my least favorite type of statement because I really don't use it. And in the industry, you won't really see this much, but you need to understand it because, again, it's something that you will see sometimes, but it's not something that's often used. Switch statement is a lot like an if-else. If. But it has limitations where you can only compare integers or any type of integer data types, and that's it. Where here you can have string data types be compared, and you can have multiple comparisons and mix relational and logical operators. With the switch case, you only have an option of comparing with using the is equals to. So let's take a look. If I rewrite this program, and I declare a choice, and I say enter A, B, C, or D. So what I'm generally doing here, I'm just trying to have the user type in A, B, or C. Now I'm just going to start using my switch case, which I'll explain in a minute. Okay, so let's take a look at what's going on here. With the switch case, what happens is you have a switch statement that is you're going to be comparing against. And your case statements are going to give you the conditions that you want to compare to. For example, if I run this program, and it's prompting me to enter A, B, or C. If I enter A, what's going to happen is it's going to go through each statement on a case-by-case basis. So it's very easy to kind of explain because, again, you go by case. So case A, it's going to say, is A equal to whatever choice the person entered? I entered A. Yes, it is. So it's going to print out entered A, and then this break statement tells the compiler to break out of this switch block. So I can see that, and see that, entered A, and then my C out of end of program. Now you're asking, well, what happens if I didn't have that break statement? Well, if you didn't have the break statement, then the compiler will say, okay, you fell into this A, but because you don't have a break, then I'm going to fall also into this B, even though that the choice is not equal to B, because the comparison is only at the first case. After that, if there is no break, it's just going to fall through. So let's take a look at that. So I enter A, press enter. See that? Entered A, entered B, because I don't have a break statement within there. So you have to be careful with this switch statement that after each case you have a break. You may the reason why you are able to do this, because sometimes you may want to fall in line with multiple cases but starting at a certain case. So if you're talking about numbers and integers, maybe you want to compare against any number that's greater than 100. So I can start at 100. Anything in 200 will still belong to anything greater than 100, so that you want to fall into case 100 and then case 200 also. And I'll give you an example of how that works. But just for your understanding, the switch case statement compares it by a case-by-case statement, and depending if there's a break, it'll break out. Now, the other thing you should look out for is the default. This is not a mandatory condition that a case that you don't have to put. You don't have to put a default statement. The default statement, like the else, executes conditional no matter what. For example, if I do lowercase a is not equal to uppercase a, and it's going to compare in a case-by-case statement. Is this true? Nope. 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 So because there's no more cases left, it's always going to do the default. So it's going to say you didn't enter either, and end of program. Okay. So what is there? Where is there a condition where, or some type of instance where when you don't need the break? Well, there's a program on page 205, and I'm going to write it real quick. That gives you a good example. So TVs come in 3 models. The 100, 200, 300. Which one do you want? CN model num. Okay, so I'm going to declare int I model num. Okay. And then I will say to cout that model has the following features. And then now I want to compare my switch, and again, this switch, you can't put any type of relational operators here. You can't put any type of logical operators here. You could only put an integer variable or a literal. That's all you could put, or a char. Unfortunately, so switch case statements are very limiting. Now, if I break this up and I say, okay, case 300, case 200, and case 100. I don't want to break here, because what's happening, and the part of this problem says, well, the 300 model is going to have everything. It's going to have everything the 100 model has, the 200 model has, and the 100 model has. So we can say picture in picture, stereo sound, remote control. And it's going to ask, you can only choose 300, 200, and 100. So what's happening here? What's happening here is you have the 300 model, the 200 model, and the 100 model. 300 model being the best. It's going to have everything that the 200 and the 100 model has. The 200 model is going to have only what the 200 model has, obviously, and then the 100 model has. And then the 100 model only has a remote control. So that if I put a 300, then it's going to say the 300 model has a picture-in-picture, stereo sound, and remote control. Same thing if I put the 200, then it's only going to have the stereo sound and the remote control, and then the 100 model will only have the remote control. So if I run this, and I put 300, see that? It has the picture-in-picture, stereo sound, and the remote control. if I put the 200 model, then what do you think is going to have? It's not going to have whatever the 300 model has because that switch case doesn't match. See that? Stereo sound and remote control. So this is one of the cases where you're going to have a switch case where you don't need a break because you want everything to fall in line depending on the selection that they put. And then we always have our default, which is going to say you can only choose 300, 200, 100. So if I put in a 600, it's going to say the model has the following features and you can only choose 300, 200, 100 in a program. So that's the way the switch case statement works. So you can have a break will break you out of that case, or you could omit the break and you can have statements fall through the switch case. Okay. Now the other thing is to remember is that you can have multiple cases, and another instance where you can have this is you have upper and lower case letters you're going to compare against. So let's say you have the following. You have, do that. And I say enter the letter grade, right? And then I say CN choice, and now I have a switch choice and case statement, right? So case A or case A, CL, good grade, break, default, valid grade. If I want to compare against an uppercase or a lowercase, then we have the A lowercase. If it's a lowercase, then it's going to fall through the uppercase statements. If it's an uppercase, then it'll just match this particular statement, and it'll print it out. So if I run this, and I do A, cool, good grade, right? So with the lowercase a, it's going to fall through. With the uppercase, it'll match exactly and execute this. Now, the other thing I didn't mention was that within this particular case, I can put many statements that I want. So you entered, and I can have a body of statements within here. You have to be careful because it can get very messy. So if I do A, so you entered A, cool grade, right? Because if you start putting many statements within case, it can get very messy in terms of your program. Switch case statements are good for menus if you want to do a menu. So if you look at page 208 and 209, it tells you what type of menus that you can build. Let's give you an example of the type of menus that you can build. Okay. Okay. So that's the switch case statement. Now the last thing I want to go over is something called the string compare, which is on Moodle. We'll just open up. Okay. So the string compare gives you the ability to compare a char array with a literal or another char array. So let's take a look at this program. I'm just going to take a look at this and I'll explain what happens as I execute. So let's comment this out. So what I'm declaring is a int match, because the string comparison function is going to return an integer value. and I have a name array with 20 bytes, and I can enter a name. And then this is when I call the strcmp, which is a string compare, and compare it with the name Joe Smith. Now, when I call the string compare, you're going to have to pass in two parameters. The first parameter should be a char array, or it could be a literal. Okay, so you can have a variable name 1 or a literal, and the second parameter will be a variable name 2, or it could be a literal like here. So it doesn't really matter. You can compare two strings that are literals, one variable versus a literal, or one literal versus a variable. It'll just do the comparison. And what it's going to give you back is an integer value of either a negative integer value, a 0, or a positive integer value. It's going to give you a negative when string 1 is less than string 2, meaning if you're talking about the alphabet, right? It's telling you that string 1 would come before string 2. So if it comes before string 2, it's going to give you a negative integer. If they are equal, then it'll give you a 0. And then if string 1 is greater than string 2, meaning string 1 in terms of dictionary in the alphabet would come after string 2, then it's going to give you a positive integer. So let's take a look. So the first thing is, if it's 0, right? Joe Smith. Name is a match. Why? Because it's telling me match is equal to 0. But remember, with a not, right, you're getting the inverse. And the only time I can get into this body of the if statement, like we learned before, is if this statement is true. Taking the condition, the result of 0, I have to do the inverse. So I'd say not true. I mean not false, which is true. Okay, that's just the way I had to do it, because when they match, it gives you a 0. I wish it gave me a 1 so that I didn't have to do that not. I wouldn't have to do that not if it gave me a result of 1 when they both matched. Now let's take a look at a string that will come before Joe Smith. So if I did Alex, Alex comes before Joe Smith because my name starts with an A. So that means that my name would come before Joe Smith if you were looking at it alphabetically, or trying to sort it alphabetically. Okay, so I will leave it up to you to see what you can put in to write in to hit this condition. Okay, we know this one and we know this one. So I'll leave it up to you to hit this condition. If you have any questions of what would hit this condition, you can always email me and I can explain it to you by email. Okay? Now, please read chapter 4. There's a lot of interesting examples on there that you can go through after each example. A lot of practice with the if, else, if. And then I also have a couple of practice exercises on Moodle. Selection statement, selection, and it has the answers with it. And we're going to have a quiz, which will be due next Monday sometime, and the payroll decision program, which will be due in 2 weeks. I'm still grading your program 1, but I'm almost there. I have to make sure that I have everybody submitting it by, I think it's due tomorrow. So please take a look at that. And if you have any questions regarding this week, let me know. I can always answer them by email. And some of you have been good in asking questions, so that's great. I will talk to you guys next week. Next week, I may not be available in terms of videos, but we'll see. Okay? So next week, we got a couple of things in line. But please take a look at that. Study hard for your quizzes, and please make sure that you review the lessons. Have a good weekend.